of you. Thank you for coming and sharing your time with us on a Friday morning. This is the session on the pharmaceutical industry outlook in Africa. We are going to talk about regional production hubs and other models of improving access to medicines on the continent. We have a great panel for you. My name is Prashant Yadav. I'm a professor of supply chain management at INSEAD, which is a business school in Fontainebleau, France, and Singapore. My work involves healthcare supply chains from manufacturing, procurement, distribution. I work closely with many manufacturers and with many country governments. And I have researched this idea of expanding production and adding new production nodes in the production network for health products, medicines, vaccines, and found myself to be at a place where sometimes I feel this is the best idea, and sometimes I feel this is something I should critique as much as I can. So at times I myself find baffling outputs coming out of looking at this, but much of this boils down to looking at this issue from precision and nuance in terms of what products, what approaches, and focusing on strategy execution and thinking of regional production as one component of an overall strategy put together by the health sector. That's what I have found in my work. Our panelists and expert speakers this morning will share more. We'll have a chance to hear from you. We'll hear their expert perspectives. So let me start by first inviting our expert speaker, Farid Fezwa. Farid is the Global Director of Health, Education and Services at IFC. He will share in a brief 7-8 minutes an overview of why this is important, why now this is a very exciting and opportune moment for us to be thinking about the pharmaceutical sector. Whether you think about regional production or you think about other models, what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years has given us a chance to strategically start thinking about the health sector and pharmaceuticals in ways that we haven't done before. And we should leverage and use that opportunity and moment to build something from it which can be longer lasting, sustainable, and can improve health outcomes for patients across countries on the African continent. So that's our goal. Farid will set us up for it, and then we'll invite our great panelists to join us. So, Farid.
Thank you, Prashant, and good morning, everyone. First, I would like to thank the organizers, Jeune Afrique. It's been a journey, Régis and the team for arranging this session, and our host country, Rwanda. Yvan is here this morning, and I wanted to reiterate our thanks as well to have us here. I'm Farid Fezwa. As Prashant has said, I lead health, education, and services within IFC. Been in the continent for a long time, serving to advance the agenda of healthcare and healthcare delivery. But as you know, IFC is the World Bank arm for private sector investment and private sector engagement. We're obviously very committed on that health agenda, both in terms of health services and the UHC agenda, but also more and more understanding that localization of the health supply chains as a whole is critical. And taking from the learnings of COVID, but also looking at preparedness in a more holistic fashion, we stand very committed to this agenda. We stand committed, but we also put dollars behind that. Over the last 20 years, we have invested an aggregate of about $9 billion on this agenda. Because we like to think that we catalyze the effort of others as well, we've mobilized another $2 billion around that agenda across the emerging markets. And if you think about just Africa over the last 4 years, we've invested a little bit more than $1 billion just doing that in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll just kick it off just to set a bit of context. The question before us, and Prashant will go deeper into the questions, but really how can we create regional manufacturing hubs in Africa, not just for vaccines, but drugs and health supplies? The need is clear. Africa is challenged by daunting pharmaceutical production divide. The continent, as we all know in this room, bears the highest relative burden of disease, 24% of the world disease burden. Yet, it still today imports 90% of its pharmaceuticals it consumes. This also has an economic burden, and we tend to think in terms of imports, but in terms of trade deficit, we're talking about close to 15 billion US dollar. So it's not just an aspiration for us, it's also in terms of economic impact. This is big. So we just need to think about how we change the equation. And local demand for pharmaceuticals, and this is on the good news in terms of perspective, is surging, which is strengthening the case, both the commercial case, but also the case for sustainable local production. Africa's pharmaceutical market is currently valued at around, a little bit less than $30 billion, but it's meant, as all the growth we're seeing in acceleration in Africa by 2030, to grow to about $42 billion. So it's not a small market. We just need to get our acts together to go after that. So I would say the localization of production and development, because it's not just production, but I'm looking at Petro, it's also nurturing the upstream development on R&D and innovation, has been kind of patchy in Africa. A lot of efforts in local production agenda has either fallen short or never happened. And when we look at why it happened, previous efforts probably narrowly focused on manufacturing ventures rather than looking at the overall ecosystem and supply chain. They did not or could not pay enough attention of what truly underpinned the sustainable manufacturing agenda, particularly supply chain. I mean, we can talk about that, but this is really a problem that we should not underestimate. Regulatory, we're just this morning preparing for this session, we talked about regulatory and the way the governments are looking at, gardening. I like the expression, not from me, it's from Petra, gardening that ecosystem that we play in. We must identify and overcome these barriers as we go, because this is what undercut the opportunities to really create a sustainable pharmaceutical value chain. So we have, therefore, an opportunity to create a vibrant pharma industry. And, Africa's CDC, as most of you know, has set the challenge for us in consultation, but also with an aspirational goal. By 2040, the continent will need to manufacture 60% of its vaccine it needs. If you expand that to pharmaceutical, I put the challenge there, sustainably, 90% of the pharmaceutical cannot still be imported to this continent. It just doesn't work. And it doesn't mean that those that today are supplying these vaccines from outside are not part of the game. Actually, they will be, but it just cannot continue like that. Regional hubs is an interesting thing. We've spent at the World Bank probably over the last 2 years really thinking hard about how we nurture and support initiative at a regional level and local level on collaboration. And we've seen, and we've been working particularly with the Secretary of ASEAN states, the World Bank, WHO, in support with the UK government and some other organizations like CEPI. And we find out through a study that we can share that actually having a regional approach to local manufacturing brings the best results and outcome than really having a national-only type of approach. So this is something that I think we all need to continue reflecting on and, more importantly, drive the execution on. Regional hubs can connect industries. They also can build on the supply chains that I've mentioned, the services, and create the markets together. And we know that creating, shaping markets and building demand in a sustainable manner is also the way to go about that. It can also work at regional level, and this is probably one of the challenges of Africa right now, level out the tariff and non-tariff barriers. That's a critical thing when you're a regional producer or a global producer. It needs to make sense from an economic standpoint to set up operations and manufacturing in one place that you can access another market or bigger market. We're seeing the change that can support regional hubs, and that's really also on the positive side. I'm looking at Yvan. We've got AMA for the first time in this continent, set in this country, that really should deliver on its promises. The good news is that the creation of AMA has been ratified by more than 50% of the member countries, which we can accept that as a stamp of approval and big support going forward. And that should boost regulatory harmonization. The African CDC mandate now includes the manufacturing of medicine, diagnostics, and vaccine. This is an opportunity. I'm seeing a lot of evolution. We were recently both in Nairobi and Lagos discussing this aspect of how the African Union is shaping up, including the demand. Recently, the African Union, as you might have seen, have also decided on approving new pooled procurement mechanisms, and which shows that we're starting to go into the nitty-gritties of shaping demand and not just talking about it. So this is really important. And within the discussion we've had as well, we're seeing ECOWAS and COMESA really thinking in the same way, because we need to accept that there is a continent-wide approach to this, but there will be necessarily a regional approach to that effort. So what's the way forward? We have, the collective action offers opportunities to really build shared efficiency and resiliency. It will also ensure that, and this is important because you don't want to, in this agenda, coming from a divide and creating another divide. So making sure that smaller countries are not left out of this agenda in Africa is critical. It's 54 countries. Not all the countries have the power of a local market, but they have the power to play an important game into this. Here, Rwanda has demonstrated that this can be done, and we're currently working with the Rwanda Development Board on building this model as well. But most importantly, it's the only route for success to support universal health coverage. We talk about universal health coverage goals. Actually, we published a report jointly, the World Bank and WHO last year, that shows that unfortunately we're not doing great on the UHC goals. We're actually kind of lagging behind. So that initiative should be part of that agenda as well. So we know the challenges, lay them out. How will we overcome them? IFC is working on really convening, planning the financing for that with every one of you in this room, bringing both the private sector and the public sector together. I think if there is something that the World Bank Group can do in catalyzing that collaboration is this. And this is not a small thing. It's a big thing to change. It's cultural. It's habits of many decades. And we're at the task to changing that. But I can tell you from the very top of the house, from Ajebanga down, this is something that we're driving very seriously. We have WHO also very seriously driving that agenda. I can tell you, Dr. Tedros, there is a local production unit on that specific agenda. I've been working with them, great people, great experts, and they're very focused. And they understand the role that the private sector can play, should play, and it's not an option in this, in driving the goals here. But we work also with other DFIs, and I want to assure you that from the DFIs, multilateral and government, this is something that there is a lot of effort politically being on there. The G7 and the G20 countries are committed, and we're working on bringing more response in terms of financing, but also understanding how you shape demand on one side and how you build supply on the other side. Once again, a shout out to Rwanda that really built the first mRNA facility in Africa for vaccine, drug substance manufacturer. We're also looking at some other parts of the continent, and that's the good news, because whether it's vaccine or whether it's drugs, we've got champions building up from, and I cite a few, Aspen Biovac in South Africa, IPD in Dakar, here in Rwanda we've mentioned. I was in Lagos last week. I can tell you there is also a fervent private sector in API manufacturing and drug substance manufacturing that is there, ready to stand, and will support them. So with this, I'll just conclude. We've made a big statement at the World Bank in terms of how many more billions of people we want to make sure we reach in access to basically low availability of health supply, but also making sure that the services are delivered. So with this, Prashant, I'll take back to you. I leave you with those questions that we have in mind, but more importantly, looking forward to hear from our great panel of friends here. Thank you.
Thank you, Farid. Thank you for setting us up with a good preface to what is the problem we are trying to solve, what are the approaches we're looking at, how is the World Bank Group and IFC addressing this. Now it's time to move deeper into what we can learn from companies, from ministries of health, companies of both global and local, and biotech, emergent biotech in the region. So that's our plan. The organizers of the Africa CEO Forum have put together a very diverse panel in terms of bringing out that there is sufficient diversity of perspective in how we address this problem. So let me start by inviting our panel. Let me start by inviting Minister of State, Dr. Yuan Batora of Rwanda, who is here with us. Dr. Batora, please join us. Next, I would like to invite Vuyo Mzikela from MSD, or what we call as Merck in the country that I live in. So, Vuyo, welcome. Vuyo heads external affairs for MSD for the African continent. Then we'll have Vimal Patel. Vimal is the CEO of Cosmos Pharmaceuticals. He'll tell us more about their company, but Vimal, welcome. Vimal Patel. Then we'll have Lutz Hagelmann. He's the president of Global Health at Novartis. And welcome, Lutz. Then we'll have Petro Terblanche. She's the CEO of Afrigen, the organization that is building the mRNA hub in South Africa and is doing interesting things in building the biotech ecosystem there. So that's our panel. Are we missing somebody? Okay. Can we have you join Farid, please? Okay, so one of the things that Farid didn't talk about, and I would like to get the panel to discuss a little bit more, is manufacturing technology for health products today has also advanced to a point that we can make things at a lower cost in smaller physical footprints. And that's what is, in a way, prompting the idea that we can do more decentralized manufacturing now, more than what we can do today. This is not just embedded in the local production agenda. This is in all of the work that we've done on continuous manufacturing, a lot of the work that has happened on looking at smaller modular manufacturing, et cetera. So I want to start with Minister Batora. We hear about the BioNTech partnership in Rwanda. We hear about the Life Sciences Park. We hear about many different ways in which you are building the biosciences ecosystem in Rwanda. Tell us more. What does it involve? What is the premise? And tell us more how it fits into the overall system an overall health strategy. So not just the manufacturing piece, how will these pieces come together? How will you look at demand, other initiatives? So, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for hosting us here all in Kigali.
Thank you so much, Prashant, and welcome to Kigali. So as you rightly said, we don't delink just the pharma production from the overall health system, right? And if you want to push it even further, you link it to economic development, right? So the way we look at it in Rwanda is you have a number of blocks that will lead eventually to delivery of these products. First is to understand the epidemiology. What are you dealing with in the country, on the continent, right? To put systems in place, public health systems in place where you can track the evolution of the burden of disease. As you will know, Africa is experiencing a growth in terms of population, but also in life expectancy, but also in changing the burden of disease. We still have an unfinished agenda of infectious disease, for which we still need to develop the vaccines and therapeutics, but also an existing one on non-communicable diseases, diabetes, cancer, and neurological diseases, and others that will also need therapeutics, but also preventive tools. So you need to understand what you're dealing with. That's one. Two is the R&D part, right? Research and development. You need to understand what are the specificity of the conditions you're dealing with. And here there's a new, fairly new development where you're talking the field of genomics, where we think here in Africa we have a large opportunity to really understand the specificity of the conditions that we have here. And this is how private sector can come in with the expertise that they have, coupling with academia, to try and understand. We're talking about precision medicine. How can we make it happen? You've seen recently for some of the conditions where you actually have developed some molecules all that are promising, be it sickle cell diseases. You had some very tough conditions where people were blind, but then you do some changes in development in CRISPR and others. We see a lot of opportunity here in Africa where we can leverage that. After that, you move to the regulatory part of it, right? You need to really have quality health products, and this is largely driven by governments to set up regulatory capacities. Here in the country, for instance, we have matured our Food and Drug Authority in the last 5 years to reach to a level that is acceptable to be able to regulate these products. But beyond that, like Farid talked about, we need to harmonize it on the continent, and that's one of the flagship organization at the continent level, the African Medicine Agency, which we are happy to host here in the country, is going to be operational very soon so that we can coordinate all that. After you have the regulatory part, then you have the manufacturing part. And like you rightly talked about, we have different advantages here on the continent, and how we're talking about regional hubs and leveraging competitiveness and as well as strength and skills of different countries. You might have some countries that have direct access to large markets, and maybe those can fit better into the later stages of the value chains in terms of fill and finish, for instance. I'm just giving examples. You have other countries, on the other hand, that have a very conducive innovation environment that can maybe go in the earlier phases of drug discovery and development, so that we can all collaboratively work together to take it. So once now you move into production, we talked about the modular facility, mRNA, that has a capacity to build 50 to 100 million doses of vaccines per year in a space that is maybe equal to what we have here, and you will have your plant running that does tremendous things like we've seen during COVID. But the same technology is really cool that you can even go to some therapeutics, right? Monoclonal antibodies and others. Some of these things that, like I talked about in NCDs Rising, some of these will be a solution to what we're seeing. But after that, you might have products, but then what? Do you have the demand on the continent? And this is a public health and a business issue as well. For instance, in Rwanda, access to health is mandatory. So we have a coverage of 96% of health insurance coverage. Our vaccination coverage has been traditionally and constantly around 96%, and that creates a certain market demand. Despite the burden of disease shifting, you have that precedent of saying, okay, how many people will be able to access this vaccine or this medicine once it comes out? Traditionally in Rwanda, it has been 96%. The same during COVID. We had an issue of getting access to COVID vaccine. But as soon as it landed in the country, we were able to reach the target of 70% in a very, very short time, because you have built health systems and supply chain systems that are able to distribute this. So I just wanted to paint a quick picture of what does it really mean, because at the end of the day, you want to get these products to the person that will be able to save their lives and then be able to contribute to the economic development of the countries and the continent at large. So that's how we're seeing, and we think it's a good thing that if we can collaborate, all of us together, we can take this to scale. There's a model that is existing. We know how things can be done. We just need to put our hands together and move things forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Butera. I think two things that I want to remind everybody what I took away from this. One is that we all talk about end-to-end building an ecosystem. These are crucial for sustainability of any regional manufacturing effort. That's the approach that Rwanda is taking. The second thing we oftentimes forget is this is not an endeavor in which we can talk about fail fast. This will test our patience. So we have to, by design, take a longer term view because this is not something that can happen overnight. So the way the strategic plan in Rwanda is laid out is build blocks of it slowly and then work towards a longer term goal. So I think those are in a way exemplar of how we should be thinking about the regional ecosystem. Let me go to Petro Trablanche from Afrigen. Petro, we hear about Afrigen, the mRNA hub that you are building. We hear about it from companies, we hear about it from the WHO leadership. What is it? Tell us more specifically. What is Afrigen doing and what is the mRNA hub about? Where are you in the stage of advancement and progress? What have you achieved? Where are you going next?
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to participate. If I may take one step back and talk a little bit about the case study, which is mRNA. 61 years after the discovery of messenger RNA and $15 billion later, only could mRNA pivot to produce one product, one disease, two products. A phenomenal breakthrough during the COVID pandemic. But what does mRNA bring? If we look at it today, despite the challenges around thermostability and cost of goods and lack of pipeline in registered products, if we analyze the world landscape, we see that there are 77 products, mRNA products, currently in development. Only 17% of those are for vaccines, so the majority will be around therapeutics. Now I want to take two steps back. 15 years ago, if you look at the top 10 blockbuster drugs in pharma, they were small molecules. If you look today, 7 or 8 of the 10 blockbuster drugs are biologics. They're biologically orientated. I want to fast forward. I believe with the modalities that mRNA has, that in 10 to 15 years, it will dominate the blockbuster landscape. So that takes us back to the theme of this conference. How does Africa get a seat at the table? And I'll offer a few models. Maybe the first one is what Rwanda has done so superbly. Set up the partnerships with the leaders in the industry and create local capacity for production of these vaccines. I offer the second model, and that takes us to the mRNA program. For the continent to create hubs where we do end-to-end research development and GMP manufacturing for clinical trial development, complete the full development cycle of novel vaccines that is of importance to the continent but also globally. So the hub that is created by the World Health Organization in South Africa in Cape Town has now completed the full construction of the only end-to-end research, development, and GMP manufacturing facility on the continent, linking to the universities in genomic discovery, antigen design, sequencing, right through to producing a product that will go into humans. The platform is being validated on a COVID-19 vaccine because there's so much data. It allows us to validate a platform which we believe is pathogen agnostic. At the same time, the hub has started to work on thermostability, reducing the cost of goods, novel and new process development for mRNA, and has 5 products in development: TB, HIV, Rift Valley fever, RSV, and gonorrhea. These are carefully selected in different classes of pathogens to demonstrate that this platform can, in fact, innovate around products needed on the continent. But what is also important, this hub in South Africa is a network model. We have 5 partners, 6 partners actually on the African continent that will receive the technology from Afrigen. BioNTech, and then of course, Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, Tunisia, and Egypt are our partners. Those partners have now completed technology transfer readiness assessments. We've already trained all of them except with Kenya in our facilities on the basics of mRNA science, and we will in the next year start to transfer a GMP process to these partners while we're developing a pipeline of products. The program was set up for pandemic response, but to be there when the next pandemic hits, we need to have inter-pandemic sustainability. And the only way to do that is to develop competitive products and to take those to market as soon as possible. So the two models, which I think is what will bring us to the table for mRNA, is the model that Rwanda has been developed here. It's the model of the mRNA hub in South Africa, where we homegrown innovation and we focus on diseases of importance. And there's a third model, which I think is the hybrid, where we have these facilities, we in-license, we fast-track the development of vaccines and the clinical development. So an end-to-end approach, but it requires patient investment. It requires a long-term vision to understand that for us to truly be competitive and participate in the mRNA landscape, we need to foster and nurture the biotech startups on this continent. So I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you, Petra. And I think one of the things that we'll keep coming back to is there are multiple approaches to achieving our sustainable regional production goals. And Rwanda is in a partnership with multiple companies or one large global biotech company. You are doing homegrown. The colleagues at the Institute Pasteur in Dakar are doing some combination of the two. So given where we are in the evolution of this, we shouldn't necessarily hone in on one type alone. We should look at multiple approaches and see which works out. Okay, I next want to go to Vimal Patel. Vimal, you've been manufacturing affordable quality medicines in Kenya and serving the region for a few decades now. The conversation in the last 4 or 5 years has re-emphasized the role of regional and local production. The Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa was created in 2014-15. Is the conversation that's happening now getting you excited? Or are you getting frustrated? Not again, you guys keep talking about it. Where do you stand? How do you feel about this?
Well, the concept, I think every new concept is interesting, right? You can't just throw it away. So my experience, as my white hair says, I've been in this business for a long time, is that we always talk about it. We always talk about local production, local production. And I've heard this story all the time. And I believe that local production, or even what we will do as a hub, it's only viable if the governments in Africa can protect these industries. It's not going to make sense to sell this if you can bring the same type of products from India, China, or anything without any tariffs. Because their cost of production right now with their volumes is high. So their costs will be cheaper and they can bring it. So we need to make it sustainable. So my thing is that I heard things like sustainability. So one thing about sustainability is local production with the demand and supply. If demand is not there, you will not get the supply. And the demand has to come by protecting African companies within Africa to sustain the supply model. Yeah? I've been hearing about APIs. You know what? Let's go to APIs. But this is not a draft board. You cannot go from here to here because of the same thing. If today I'm in the NCD market, if I want to buy some APIs from India or something, it's far cheaper than I would buy from anywhere in Africa if there was somebody making. The reason is, again, there's no tariff barriers. So you will get it cheaper there. So I think we need to address that tariff thing. We've been talking a lot of times about, yes, local production. The governments over 20 years have been doing it. And I say to every meeting that I go to, that you know what, if you come to my office, I've got a full room of studies. All the studies are there. And they're all being financed by donors. And I think sometimes, it's a waste of money. Why? Although the goodwill is there to do it, the execution is not there. I think the problem we have today, and we've always had, is the execution. No matter, I don't know, there's this thing about we want local production, we want sustainability, but the execution is not there. And I think that's the one thing we need to address. How do we execute? Because a strategy is as good as nothing if you don't execute it. So that's one thing. Now, of course, regional hubs excites me because I'd like to see how, apart from vaccines, it can help in the other pharmaceutical field. But I think, again, it's going to be strangulated if the African governments cannot protect the local industries. It will be. I know there are certain companies that have been making APIs in Africa. They're not doing very well because, again, they can import raw materials straight away. I also think that, you know, while we are doing all these studies and while we're doing this, I sometimes feel, because I'm the chair of the pharmaceutical industry also in Kenya, and I feel that how come these local guys are not being involved in how these plans are going to work or not? Because they've been in the ground. They know what's happening. They know the terrains. Yeah? So I would rather have these ideas also being involved with the local manufacturers, because I think they've gone through the ground, they know the terrain and everything. The ML3, I think I like the idea, but the problem is, this is the case. Even in Kenya, even in other African countries, the level of GMP compliance from one company to another is a lot different, okay? Regulatory needs to improve. But the push that I've seen, and I talk about the association in Africa, in Kenya, there are a number of manufacturers, there are 34 manufacturers. It's like, okay guys, we are pushing for ML3, which is good, But we need to do, while pushing, how are we going to push this and what are the consequences? It's not getting into a bulldozer and driving the bulldozer and smashing buildings. Because what I've seen that the regulator is pushing ML3 and there are things, pitfalls that you come through and you will get the industries that have already started to collapse. Is that what we want? We understand we want quality, but there has to be a process. And we need to take that process into context. And it's a culture change. Cultures don't change just like that. So that's my input on that. And I just finally want to say, governments, start doing what we must do. Let us not talk about India. I think we are tired of talking about India, that this is a country of generics, they've mastered everything. Let's do it in Africa. We have the blueprint, execute it. Thank you.
Thanks, Vimal. To an operations management professor, when somebody says operational execution matters more than strategy, it's music. We like to think operational execution needs strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And culture is another thing that matters. So thank you for grounding us on this aspect. Also bringing out this issue of ML3, regulatory, quality, heterogeneity. How do we manage this? It's not simple, it's not straightforward, but at least we know where things need to be looked at more carefully. Okay. So next I want to go to Vuyo Njikela from MSD. I have two questions for you, Vuyo. One is, how do you think about regional production expansion in your supply network design? How do you validate that decision? Is that happening? We hear about in other countries, you have partnerships where you have a manufacturing partner. Are you thinking about that actively? And in doing so, where does your thinking stand? That's my first question. The second is, as a global life sciences company, you probably think about improving access not just through regional production, but through other means. And what are one or two things that stand out to you as, oh, this is what is getting us to improve patient outcomes or access?
Hi. Good. Okay, it's on. Thank you so much, Prashant. So if I can, I'll start with the second question. And it actually does link to the theme of regional hubs and local manufacturing. I think probably the foremost access solution, that we have used to really make a difference in Africa has been our partnership with Gavi and UNICEF. Through the provision of vaccines and utilizing their pooled procurement mechanism. We provide HPV vaccines through Gavi and UNICEF to 24 countries across sub-Saharan Africa. And I think what this does is it demonstrates the power of pooled procurement, which of course is a really critical enabler for regional hubs. I think the decision and the endorsement, a resolution by the African Union to allow centralized procurement through Africa CDC is a really big step forward when we start thinking about what pooled procurement can do for Africa to support local production and enable regional hubs. And that's something that we look to with great interest. I think the most important thing, though, is, we are a continent. We've made good strides in terms of harmonization. We have the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. There's now regulatory harmonization through AMA. Those are incredible steps, but we're still 54 sovereign nations. And when we talk about centralized procurement, that still has to be tied and enabled at a domestic level by national policy. And so even though we make that decision at a continental level, each country and their Ministry of Finance needs to enact legislation that will allow procurement and offtake from Africa CDC, for example. And I think that was the biggest challenge we saw during the COVID pandemic with the establishment of the Vaccines Acquisition Task Team, is the failure, I think, of national procurement policies to enable and support the continental procurement. And that's a heavy, heavy lift. And I think it's something that's been acknowledged by Africa CDC. Where we sit right now is looking at these things as opportunities. And I like what the Minister of State mentioned earlier in terms of the first step and looking at the epidemiology and the changing disease profile on the continent. If we consider the facts, the rise of NCDs, the rapid rise of cancers, and we also look at the direction of innovation in the medicine space and life science space, it's moving as well in this direction, as well as moving towards targeted therapies, personalized care, biologics, as Petra mentioned. And so if we start thinking about regional production in a very strategic way, and we start thinking about the horizon, we have to ask ourselves, how are markets created? Because whether you are a local manufacturer or a large manufacturer that's global, the fundamental that drives production is markets. Markets where there's demand, where we can reply and respond with supply, but markets that exist where there's willingness to pay and ability to pay. So if we think about the trajectory of innovation, the trajectory of our disease profiles, I think my key question is, how are we starting to think about how we enable the growth of markets in Africa? And I think Fareed talked about the work World Bank and IFC are doing. There has to be an almost national or broader view of our health systems that integrate both public and private finance mechanisms that also look at how to integrate and pull the fragmented payer ecosystem we have, where we just have individuals paying out of pocket. We need to bring all that together to establish risk pools that are actually able to pay for some of this innovation, pay for some of these medicines and vaccines that are developed locally. One example I like to use is, if you think about South Africa, for an originator company like MSD, the minute we lose exclusivity, we're out of that business. For local manufacturers or biosimilar companies from other countries are there. They dominate the market immediately. But what happened before that? When we had that protection, we invested in creating a market, and that's why they were ready to come in. In other African countries, we can remain having market dominance for an innovator product that's lost exclusivity for years and years and years. because a market has not been established. Biosimilar companies, generic companies are not ready to enter. We've even done voluntary licenses to expand access and had no uptake from local manufacturers because a market doesn't exist. So I would argue that if you want to really start moving in a direction where you're thinking about the full value chain, R&D, clinical trials, regulatory authorizations, access to markets, you need to think of the future and you need to let innovators and originators create markets. And that means we have to create some kind of system that allows for those products to enter so that you create a pipeline for local manufacturing.
Thank you, Vuyo. And I think it's important to keep in mind that if we fix the demand side, that in a way is agnostic to whether it's a local manufacturer, regional manufacturer, global life sciences company. So that is something we've got to do irrespective of what channel and what manufacturing footprint we look at. And that's in a way a very important step for governments and ministries of health to take on board. Lutz, from your company's perspective, a large global footprint, both in terms of distributing, also manufacturing. How do you think about manufacturing expansion? Same question as to Vuyo. And secondly, when you think about improving access to your health products and technologies to patients across Africa, what are things that stand out to you as, here is how we can do it?
Yeah, thanks for the question and thanks for having me. Let me start with the idea of manufacturing in Africa, which for Novartis is a proven concept. We set up our first manufacturing plant in Egypt in 1962, so it's more than 60 years in operation. And we've been able at peak times to produce more than 1 billion of medicine packs per year out of this manufacturing plant, and we are serving more than 50 countries out of Egypt with a select part of our portfolio. And when you calculate the societal impact that this investment has, then we are adding $700 million per year, essentially to the Egyptian economy. So two summaries here. The first one is that, yes, manufacturing can be done successfully in Africa, and it can drive prosperity in the country and for the country in which you operate. Now, the other question that we discussed earlier today is how does manufacturing in Africa deliver a benefit for Africa as a continent, or even in that case for North Africa as a region? And here I must say it's none. And the barriers that stand in the way here is the tremendous fragmentation that we see across the continent, whereby it's more difficult for some sub-Saharan African countries to import a medicine from Egypt than it is to import a medicine from Switzerland or from Turkey or from some of our other global manufacturing sites. And here I believe we need to work together to create a harmonized situation on the continent, and I'm very excited by the work that the African Union is doing, the Africa Free Continental Trade Area, where we advocated for health and pharmaceuticals to become one of their 4 core focus areas alongside automotive technology and what have you, because we believe that a harmonized market in Africa can unleash the economies of scale that 1.6 billion arguably of people have to bring about. But those are some of the changes that we need to make in order to derive benefits from the local manufacturing for the entire continent, or at least for a region. The African Medicines Agency being planned to be based here in Rwanda, certainly another tremendous step forward, but we can't ignore the fact that currently only 50% of the countries have ratified the treaty. And as long as we have to produce for 54 bespoke markets that require regulatory approval in each and every market, that require bespoke packaging in each and every market, we cannot unleash the economies of scale that exist. And that, in my mind, is the greatest barrier. And we need to consider those changes in lockstep with the discussion on local manufacturing. So we cannot fool ourselves and believe if we build more manufacturing plants, leave everything else unchanged, we are going to create a a better situation in Africa. We need to look at the entire ecosystem. We need to do that in a holistic way. One additional element that strikes me is that we also need to consider what is the current burden of disease that exists in Africa and focus on medicines that address the current burden of disease. We are one of the few manufacturers of antimalarial medicines. It's by volume by far our largest medicine. We have, over the last 20 years, delivered more than 1 billion doses. And to me, it would make perfect sense to produce the next antimalarial medicine where 90% of the volume will go to the African continent in Africa. Do we need bespoke, personalized cancer medicine at this point in time at scale where the number of eligible patients globally becomes smaller and smaller? I'm not so certain. Let's focus on where the current burden of disease lies, and let's find ways through particularly small molecules that are also the lowest barrier of complexity in order to establish local manufacturing, and let's deliver benefit for people in Africa now and not in 10 or in 20 years. Now, coming to your last question around access, which I think has the highest level of complexity of what we are discussing today, then our approach has been to systematically look at barriers that stand in the way of patients being able to access care and access appropriate medicines. And manufacturing and supply chain is one element that speaks to the notion of availability and affordability. And that needs to come together with a consideration of, is my medicine fit for purpose to be used in a health system that we have in Africa? So it's that R&D component. Do I design my medicines with a use in African health systems in mind? Are medicines available and affordable? And then the third one, and in my experience, that is the most complex and the hardest one, but also the most important one, is the health system ready to utilize technical innovation to the ultimate benefit of the patients. Because if we don't diagnose patients, then they will never benefit from a medicine that could be curing their disease. So again, here we have to take a holistic approach. We need to build a continuum of care, and that is where Novartis Sub-Saharan Africa works with partners, with governments, with health systems, with philanthropy, with NGOs, with professional associations in order to create that continuum of care so that patients ultimately can have access to the medicines they need.
Thank you, Lutz. Very comprehensive. So I think we have time for maybe one question while people are, yes, please state your name, organization, and if your question is directed to a particular panelist, say that. If not, it could be general, we'll figure out. Thanks, Vimol.
Hi. Hi, my name is Jean-André Barsin. I am the Chief Investment Officer of the Sovereign Fund of Djibouti. The reason why I'm here is because Djibouti is trying to get into the partnerships that you mentioned. And so I specifically came from Djibouti to assist to this panel to meet you and see how we can get involved. And if I'm saying this, then I need to tell you why we should get involved. Djibouti is situated on the Bab el-Mandeb in the Red Sea, and we see 30% of the world shipping going through our coast. And as you know, we have a very advanced and modern port infrastructure, and we are also invested a lot in free zones. And so we think that we have built the foundation really to partake into the development of the pharmaceutical industry in Africa. And part of my mandate as a Chief Investment Officer of the Sovereign Fund of Djibouti is to develop and make sure that we invest in that industry. So I would really please welcome opportunities to have follow-up conversation with all of you to see how we can bring you to Djibouti and also us participate in the partnership that you mentioned, but also with Novartis and others to see how we can contribute.
Thank you for your...
I'm really happy to see you because I'm an inside MBA graduate from 2015D, so I took your class.
Welcome. So I think I'm glad that sovereign wealth funds and other investment vehicles are thinking about it. That is one big achievement we've gotten out of discussing this, that in the past, we had very few sovereign wealth funds who would come and say, I'm interested in pharmaceuticals, because they used to think, this is working, there's no investment opportunity. So the fact that there is growing interest itself is a sign that we've elevated the agenda of health to many investment groups. Our panel will be happy to talk to you, so thank you for coming. Okay, we have 5 minutes left. Here's what I want to do. I want to give our panelists a chance to do a one sentence, like a 30-second future outlook of the pharmaceutical industry in Africa. I'll start with Lutz. Outlook, next 20 years, pharmaceutical industry in Africa, what do you see? Manufacturing happening here? What products? What are the things?
I'm an optimist, and I've been watching the development of the continent for the last 20 years or so. And I think we will see tremendous accomplishments. I think that we'll need some sort of pivoting points. For instance, the African Union ultimately being able to leverage the size of the market, regulatory harmonization going to happen. And once that happens, then we'll see an exponential development. For the time being, I think we have countries who are very open, very structured, like Rwanda, like other countries, where we will see local benefits. But ultimately, in order to bring that to scale, we need this harmonization, we need continued commitment, and we also need to develop an appreciation for the complexity of the environment in which we operate. And let's not focus on isolated solutions, but let's look at how all of these solutions can work in concert.
Thank you. William, industry
Thank you.
outlook,
I
one
know,
sentence.
very quick. So I see a future where every individual African has some degree of comprehensive health insurance, where those that have access to more are comfortable to cross-subsidize those who have less, and where it's underpinned by public-private partnerships, and able then to integrate innovation in Africa and not wait to be the last to get access to what we need.
Yes. So the technology in biotechnology and medicine is advancing very, very fast. Africa shouldn't miss this train. So we need to create the ecosystem that allows for innovation, where these leading innovation companies can just come and plug and play. And that's what we're working on with IFC to have a life science park. Secondly is the workforce. The workforce really needs to be up to date to what's happening and foresee what's going to come. So what we're doing here in Rwanda, the Africa Biomanufacturing Institute is going to partner with leading academic and private sector to be able to be up to date and preempt what's going to come in the future, so that you are able to deliver this product within functional health systems.
Thank you. Vimal.
So to me, although there are challenges, I see a future that is optimistic. I like challenges, because if it's a world without any challenges, you're not going to enjoy your way forward. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, and I'm excited about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Vimal. Petra.
I think for the first time, I have great hope that we will building the ecosystem from bottoms up to top down. We will have Africa incorporated. We will not only import medicines, we will produce and we will innovate and supply innovative medicines to the rest of the world. This continent has the ability to do that, and we've started on that journey.
Thank you. Farid, in addition to the 1.5 billion people by 2030, what other outlook?
Yes, few things. First, supporting governments, regulatory harmonization. Second, a private sector, local manufacturing that is quality and cost efficient. Because if it's cost efficient, it will realize what Vimal said, and we need to protect them so that they get there in time, not kill them. And what Viyu said about then when an MSD or Novartis runs out of medicine, then that is a catcher in Africa. Third is what Petro and Ivan said. On precision medicine, the future of medicine, Africa cannot be on the menu. It needs to be at the table. And that we need to support. And what Petro is doing, small startups, we need to support. Governments like Rwanda, we need to support. And we need to find ways, we're not there yet, but we need to do that. Last, I'll finish with the 1.5 billion. This is the aspiration. I want local producers
of vaccines and drugs and diagnostic, to your point, Lutz, to serve the $1.5 billion. I want Africa to be a big part of this $1.5 billion that have more access to healthcare and a big part of the 4.5 billion people that do not have access today to proper healthcare.
Thank you. Thank you, each of the panelists. One last parting remark I want to make as we run out of time almost is think about the exciting things that are happening, and I just want to summarize so that you take them away. The African Medicines Agency, we've been talking about regulatory harmonization for decades now on the African continent. It's a reality. It has been ratified by half or more than half of the countries. There's an office, there's resourcing, there's structure, there's governance board. Things have come in place for the African Medicines Agency. That is a remarkable achievement for the pharmaceutical industry in Africa. Let's accept and celebrate that. Second, the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Amongst the first set of products that will be prioritized and work through the AFCTA, pharmaceuticals and health products are one of them. Once again, we've talked about fragmentation in the markets, not having the trade routes to get product from one country to the other. That problem is getting solved. Yes, it's not solved entirely, but we are making progress with the CFTA. Third thing, or at least on the vaccine side, for the demand side of the African vaccine manufacturers, there is the Gavi African Vaccine Manufacturing Accelerator, which pays the milestone payment, which pays a top-up. So there is a market creation element attached, at least on the vaccine side. We don't have that memo for small molecules yet, but hopefully things will come from government. What we see in Rwanda is an exemplar of how to build the entire ecosystem. Think about the future, think about present-day products and future products. Lutz reminded us that we can't just talk about precision medicines. We also have to make antimalarials because there is a large burden. We also have to make antiretrovirals. We also have to make antibiotics, other things, right? At the same time, we should have a future outlook. And we see in what Petro is doing, what Rwanda is doing, the culmination of we look at present, we look at the future. Yes, the planning horizons for the future are slightly different. The kind of things that need to go in are different, but we have to keep an eye on that. We got constant reminders that demand side, government coming together to pay, fixing the demand side, the payment systems, the procurement models is important. Some interesting developments happening with the African Union or Africa CDC's pool procurement announcement. Again, it boils down to what will it amount in terms of strategy or operational execution, as Vimal said. We'll wait and watch. But in summary, lot of factors that are converging together to make it a very exciting moment. If you're an investor in the pharma sector in Africa, this is the best investment period that has been. If you are anybody who works in the ecosystem, this is the best time to reinforce your partnership pledge and come together. With that, I want to thank my panel, thank all of you. Thank you again. If the panel could stay, I think we want to, there was a picture I was told will